I saw it all, his body over hers, that familiar smile now mirrored on my cousin's lips, in the bed of the man who had proposed to me hours before. The pain should have destroyed me, but it became a weapon instead. My plan: infiltrate his inner circle and return the humiliation. I didn't pick just anyone. I chose the king, his father, Vittore Montreal, the patriarch who commands everything with a single look. He wasn't just a piece in the game, he was the entire board. What I didn't expect was that the second he touched me, revenge would stop mattering. Chapter 1. The most expensive yes of her life. The Montreal restaurant was steeped in the kind of curated silence that only extreme wealth can afford. The sort of quiet where even the staff seemed to glide across the floor like ghosts. Beneath the amber glow of crystal chandeliers, the dark mahogany tables gleamed, and the air carried the scent of vintage wine and fresh-cut lilies, replaced so frequently that the concept of a wilted petal was a family scandal. I sat beside Adriano, draped in the navy blue silk he had chosen for me. Every time he squeezed my hand under the table, a steady pulse of warmth climbed my arm, settling in my chest like a vow. At the far end of the table, my sister Tessa held her glass of red wine as if it were a natural extension of her hand. Her gaze was sharp, scanning the room and cataloging every face and movement with a silent precision. That was her way: observation first, words later, and never a syllable wasted. Across from her, Darcy, my closest friend from college, was already working on her second glass of champagne, making no effort to hide her wide-eyed fascination with the sheer opulence of the room. Then, Adriano stood. The entire room seemed to hold its breath as he pushed back his chair and turned to face me. He wore the smile that always shattered my defenses, a look too perfect to be fair, too bold to be innocent. He had the kind of face that made you forget to look for what lay beneath it. When his knee touched the floor, and that velvet box opened in his palm, my world narrowed until everything else vanished, leaving only him and that single life-altering gesture. "Brielle," he said, his voice a masterclass in controlled emotion, his blue eyes locked onto mine as if the rest of the world had ceased to exist. "I knew it was you from the very first day. Will you spend the rest of your life proving me right?" The ring was staggering, an oval diamond set in white gold. It captured the light and threw it back in sharp, silent bursts of brilliance. Darcy let out a sound that was half sigh, half choke, muttering to Tessa, "If she says no, I'm marrying him." Tessa didn't flinch. She simply tilted her glass toward Darcy with an expression that commanded silence, while admitting, just as silently, that she was impressed. "Yes," I whispered, and the word felt more natural than any I had ever spoken. The room broke into polite, rhythmic applause, sounding as though every clap had been sanctioned by the family elders. Adriano slid the diamond onto my finger, stood, and kissed me. The kiss tasted of champagne and a bright, certain future. I believed in it completely, because I wanted to, because I needed to, and because at 24, I still thought that if you believed in something hard enough, it became the truth. The rest of the evening blurred into a montage of toasts and laughter. I was barely present, too occupied with the weight of the ring and the beautiful promise it represented. Tessa eventually made her way over to hug me, whispering that I deserved every bit of this happiness. I squeezed her hand. In that room full of people, hers was the only opinion I truly cared about. That was when Vittore Montreal made his move. I had watched him from the periphery all night, a shadow at the edge of the light, glass in hand, though he rarely drank. The patriarch of the family didn't just occupy space, he dominated it. He was broad-shouldered and tall, with dark hair and eyes so deep a brown they appeared black under the chandeliers. At 49, Vittore lacked his son's effortless, boyish charm. He had something far more potent: gravity. He was the kind of man who made you straighten your spine without even realizing you were doing it. "Congratulations," he said, his voice so deep I felt the vibration in my chest before the word reached my ears. He offered his hand. When I took it, his grip was firm and controlled, lasting just a second longer than protocol required. It was long enough for me to register the heat of his palm, the rough texture of his skin, and the fleeting pressure of his thumb against the back of my hand. His eyes held mine for a moment that defied the word brief. There was something in that gaze I couldn't decipher. It wasn't cold, and it certainly wasn't the polite welcome of a future father-in-law. It was something else entirely. I was the first to look away, offering a reflexive smile and a thank you I would forget a moment later. I turned back to Adriano, who pulled my hand toward him with the ease of a man reclaiming a trophy. Vittore stepped back into the shadows without a word, and I pushed the feeling into a dark corner of my mind, pretending it had never happened. The night was perfect, a picture frame memory. Saturday morning arrived with the Chicago sun flooding my apartment, bringing with it the blissful realization that Friday hadn't been a dream. I lay in bed, turning the ring against the light, smiling at the ceiling like a fool. The idea hit me while I was getting ready. I would surprise Adriano with breakfast. I'd show up at his place with the croissants from the French bakery he loved, greeting him with the smile of a woman who had just won the world. I dressed quickly, grabbed the spare key he'd given me months ago, and hailed a cab. Outside, the Chicago wind was brutal, slicing through the city, but I was insulated by a happiness that felt indestructible. Adriano's building in the Gold Coast was a tower of glass and steel, designed to remind the world that the people inside lived on a different plane. I walked through the lobby with practiced ease, waved to the doorman who knew my name, and headed for the elevator. The hallway on the 12th floor was deathly quiet. I reached apartment 1204, turned the key as quietly as possible, and eased the door open, already imagining the look of sleepy surprise on his face. The sound reached me before the sight did. A laugh, low, feminine, tangled with another voice. Adriano's, husky with that specific morning rasp. The sounds drifted from the bedroom, just a few steps away, twisting together with an intimacy that felt like a physical blow to my stomach. I should have turned around. I should have dropped the bag of pastries and walked away with my dignity and my illusions intact. But my feet moved of their own accord, drawing me toward the half-open door. Adriano never closed doors. He lived as if the world was his audience. I pushed the door open before I could talk myself out of it. Adriano was in bed, and he wasn't alone. I saw the blonde hair on the pillow before I recognized the face, a shade of blonde I had seen in family albums since I was a child. Allegra, my cousin, my own blood, tangled in the sheets with the man who had put a ring on my finger less than 24 hours ago. The laughter died the second Adriano saw me. His face shifted through a frantic sequence. Shock, terror, and then the cold, calculated look of a man trying to build a lie out of broken pieces. Allegra pulled the sheet to her chin in a pathetic attempt at modesty. I looked for guilt in her eyes, but all I found was the panic of a caught animal. There was no remorse. "Brie," Adriano started, swinging his legs out of bed and holding his hands up as if he could rewrite reality with a gesture. "This isn't what it looks like. Let me explain." I looked at him, then at her. I looked at the tangled sheets and the half-empty wine glass on the nightstand. Wine, because Adriano always used it to dress up his cheapest impulses. The ring on my finger suddenly felt like a shackle. "You don't need to explain," I said, my voice startlingly level. It was flat and cold, as if I had been preparing for this moment my entire life. "What I'm seeing says everything you'll never have the spine to admit." He opened his mouth, but I didn't give him the chance. I pulled the ring off in one sharp motion. No drama, no hesitation, none of the cinematic pause people expect. The diamond that had looked like a promise now looked like a common stone. I set it on the dresser by the door, turned, and walked down the hallway without a single glance back. I didn't cry, not because I wasn't hurting. The pain was a physical weight in my chest, jagged and hot, but I refused to give him my tears. I wouldn't give her the satisfaction of watching me break. If I was going to fall apart, I would do it where they couldn't watch. The elevator ride was a vacuum of silence. I crossed the lobby and met the freezing Chicago wind, hailing a cab with mechanical precision. Inside the car, as the city blurred into streaks of gray and glass, the mask finally cracked. The tears fell without a sound, and I bit my cheek hard enough to taste copper. The driver said nothing. Perhaps he was used to women breaking in the back of his cab. The pain was immense, filling every corner of my body. But beneath the betrayal and the humiliation, something else was beginning to take root. It wasn't sadness. It was something sharper, something with teeth. It was rage, and rage didn't want me to hide. It wanted me to move. It wanted me to plan. Adriano Montreale was not going to see me destroyed. He was going to see me standing, and he was going to learn the true cost of discarding someone like me. I didn't know the method yet. I didn't know the timing. But as the cab tore through the streets and the salt of my tears mixed with the blood in my mouth, a decision hardened inside me. He was going to pay, and the price would be so high, he would spend the rest of his life wondering how he could have been so blind. Chapter 2. The look. No one was supposed to see. 4 days. It had been 96 hours since I'd walked out of that Gold Coast apartment, my legs moving on autopilot while my world collapsed behind me. 4 days since the image of Allegra clutching those sheets had burned itself into my mind. A haunting, high-definition photograph that played on a loop every time I tried to close my eyes. Sleep had become a luxury I no longer qualified for. It was Wednesday afternoon, and I was curled on the sofa in Tessa's Lincoln Park apartment. I held a cup of tea between my palms, using it more as a heater than a drink. Tessa's place was a sanctuary of oversized windows and uncomfortable truths, overlooking a stretch of park that currently consisted of nothing but skeletal trees and a bruised Chicago sky. My sister had lived here alone since she was 23. She thrived on silence, expensive red wine, and the kind of brutal honesty that most people spent their lives trying to avoid. That was exactly why I was here. My own apartment felt like it was drowning in a silence I couldn't control. "Have you actually eaten today?" Tessa asked from the kitchen. Her voice carried that specific older sister weight, the kind that already knew the answer and was just waiting to catch you in the lie. "Yes," I lied. Technically, I'd managed a few bites of yogurt hours ago, which felt like a feast given the knot in my stomach. Tessa appeared in the doorway, a plate of toast in one hand, and a look of total authority in her eyes. She set the food down on the coffee table without a word, and sank into the armchair opposite me, crossing her legs with the effortless grace of someone who never had to wonder if she was in charge of a room. I ate the toast, not because I was hungry, but because I didn't have the strength to argue with her. The silence between us was heavy, but familiar. I could see the gears turning behind Tessa's dark eyes. She was holding her coffee mug with both hands, a gesture she only used when she was weighing the impact of what she was about to say. "I need to tell you something," she said. It wasn't a request. I looked up, waiting. When Tessa used that tone, you listened. "The night of the engagement," she began, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. "I spent the whole dinner doing what I do best. I watched. And there was something about Vittore Montreale that I haven't been able to shake. What about him? He didn't take his eyes off you, Brielle. Not just once or twice. All night, every time I glanced his way, he was staring at you. It was constant. A strange, sharp sensation flared in my chest. Suddenly I was back in that restaurant, feeling the rough texture of his palm against mine, and the lingering pressure of his thumb on the back of my hand. I had buried that moment deep, hoping it would just wither away. Apparently it hadn't. "Tessa," I said, trying to find a comfortable position on the cushions. "He's the head of the family. He's probably just keeping tabs on everyone. It's about control, or surveillance, or whatever it is men like him do." "It wasn't surveillance," Tessa countered, her voice dropping an octave. "Surveillance is clinical. This was something else. He looked at you as if the rest of the room had simply ceased to exist. That wasn't the look of a father-in-law, Brie. It was darker, much darker." The room went still. Outside, the muffled hum of city traffic drifted through the glass, but all I could hear was the steady, rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. "The man is nearly 50, I pointed out, as if a number could somehow erase the memory of the way the world had blurred when our eyes met. "And?" Tessa raised an eyebrow. "And he's Adriano's father. Ex-fiancé," she corrected, her voice like a blade. "The man you caught in bed with our cousin. Any obligation to that family's loyalty died the moment Adriano stepped out of his clothes for Allegra. I tried to find a comeback, but I was empty. Tessa had a terrifying ability to strip away the excuses I used to protect myself. I stared down at my lukewarm tea, watching the way the light hit the floor, and let the most dangerous thought in my head slip out loud. "He's not exactly unattractive." Tessa nearly choked on her coffee. She sputtered, a few drops of dark liquid splashing onto the armchair, but she didn't take her eyes off me. "Not unattractive?" she repeated, her voice rising in disbelief. "Brielle, that man looks like he was carved out of granite by an artist who was furious at the rest of the world for being mediocre. Not unattractive is for accountants. Vittore Montreal is a walking international crisis." I bit the inside of my cheek to keep from smiling. Agreeing with her felt like opening a door I wasn't sure I could ever close again. Tessa just watched me, a small, knowing smirk tugging at the corner of her mouth. She'd planted the seed. Now, she just had to wait. By Friday night, the seed had grown into a decision. I stood in front of my bedroom mirror in Wicker Park, zipped into a black dress I hadn't touched in months. It was tight in all the right places, with a back that dipped dangerously low, exposing the curve of my spine. The woman in the reflection didn't look like a victim. She didn't look like she'd spent the week living on toast and heartbreak. She looked like a woman with a purpose. I didn't have a map, but I had an impulse. I needed to be seen. I needed to reclaim the version of myself that Adriano hadn't managed to ruin. If I spent one more night replaying the betrayal in my head, I was going to break in a way I couldn't fix. Darcy arrived at 10, her cab's horn blaring like a getaway car. She burst into the apartment looking like a hurricane in red lipstick and stilettos. She took one look at my dress and pointed a finger at me. If Adriano saw you right now, he'd actually have a heart attack, she declared. He'd call his mother and apologize to God. Let's go. We headed out into the freezing Chicago night. The wind was a sharp reminder that I was still capable of feeling something other than phantom pain. Where are we going? I asked as we slid into the back of the cab. A new spot everyone is losing their minds over, Darcy said, her eyes gleaming. Exclusive, expensive, and filled with people who have too much money and not enough sense. The kind of place where you make an entrance, and no one ever forgets it. The city blurred past the window, a streak of neon and steel. Darcy chattered about music and cocktails, but I was focused on the horizon, my heart beating with a frantic, restless rhythm. The cab pulled up in front of a dark stone building. Golden lights traced the architecture, giving the entrance an almost regal glow. The line of people on the sidewalk was small and meticulously dressed, the kind of crowd that didn't wait in line because they had to, but because they wanted to be seen doing it. The security was subtle, men in tailored suits who looked like they were hiding weapons behind polite smiles. This is it? I asked, stepping onto the damp pavement. This is it, Darcy confirmed, adjusting her hair. Ready to forget that coward for a few hours? I looked at the facade, at the heavy doors that exhaled pulses of bass and warm, expensive air. I noticed a discreet crest etched into the stone, a crowned lion above crossed swords. I didn't recognize it at the time. I didn't know it was the Montreal mark. We walked inside. The club was a velvet-lined vault. It was vast and dim, bathed in amber light that made everyone look like a character in a dream. The music was a deep, physical throb that settled in my bones. Darcy grabbed my hand and led me deeper into the golden haze, her excitement infectious. I had no idea the family owned this place. I didn't know that the lion crest was a mark of loyalty that their men wore on their skin. I didn't know that every inch of this room belonged to one man, and I certainly didn't know that he was here. But when my eyes finally scanned the room, they locked onto a figure standing perfectly still amidst the chaos of the dance floor. He was holding a glass, a silent statue of marble and shadows, Vittore Montreal. His eyes were already fixed on mine, and this time, I didn't look away. Chapter 3, His Territory. I should have looked away. The logical part of my brain, the sliver of self-preservation that usually dictated my choices, screamed at me to break eye contact. Any woman with a sense of survival would have turned her back the moment she met the heavy, dark gaze of Vittore Montreale in the middle of a nightclub that was clearly his personal fiefdom. But my muscles refused to cooperate. My eyes stayed locked on his, and a strange, reckless pulse inside my chest forbade me from retreating. It was as if the part of me still operating on raw instinct had decided that running was no longer a viable strategy. He made the first move. Vittore sliced through the crowded room with a stride that was neither rushed nor hesitant. It was the rhythmic, predatory cadence of a man who knows that no one is foolish enough to block his path, and that any attempt to do so would be settled swiftly and unpleasantly. The crowd seemed to drift apart without even realizing they were doing it, drawn away by the invisible gravitational force he radiated. He was dressed entirely in black, a button-down with an open collar, no tie, and sleeves rolled back to his forearms with a calculated informality that carried more weight than a three-piece suit. He came to a halt less than 3 feet from me. His cologne reached me before his voice did, a deep, woodsy scent with a sharp, dark undertone that I couldn't identify, a fragrance that lodged itself in the back of my throat like a secret yet to be told. "What is my son's fiancé doing here?" His voice was a low, resonant vibration, tuned specifically so that only I could hear it over the throb of the music. It wasn't a question. It was the kind of statement powerful men use to let you know they already have the facts and are merely giving you the opportunity to confess. Alone, in a place like this, without an escort. His jaw was set like granite, his obsidian eyes fixed on mine with an intensity that should have terrified me. Instead, it ignited something beneath my skin that I hadn't given permission to exist. I held his gaze, not because I was brave, but because looking away would be a surrender. I had already lost control of my life this week. I wasn't about to hand over the last of my dignity to him. "I'm not anyone's fiancé," I replied. My voice was unexpectedly firm, as if the words had been forged in the fire of my own collapse over the last 5 days. "Your son took care of that himself." A subtle shift passed over his face. With a man like Vittore, emotions were measured in millimeters. His jaw tightened by a fraction, his eyes narrowed slightly, and a shadow flickered across his expression so fast it was almost a hallucination. But it was real. What I saw wasn't pity, nor was it the practiced indifference of a patriarch who had seen it all. It was something primal, a raw, dangerous possessiveness, It was as if Adriano's betrayal wasn't just a failure of character, but a personal transgression against something Vittore considered his own property. He didn't ask for the details. He didn't offer a hollow apology or the standard platitudes. He simply stood there, absorbing the weight of the situation, processing not the information itself, but the tactical reality of what he would do with it. "Excuse me," I managed to say, because the air between us had become too heavy to breathe. I turned toward the bar, where Darcy was waiting with 2 drinks and an expression of pure shock. Vittore didn't move to stop me, but I could feel his gaze like a brand on my back as I walked away. Hot, oppressive, and impossible to ignore. It wasn't the look of someone watching you go. It was the look of someone tracking their prey. Darcy gripped my arm the second I reached the counter, her fingers digging in like she was holding on to someone about to fall off a cliff. "What on earth was that?" she hissed. Her eyes were still glued to the spot where I'd left him, where Vittore stood perfectly still, looking like the club had been built specifically to serve as his pedestal. Because I just watched the head of a family, a man I'm terrified to even name, look at you like you were the only source of water in a desert. "He's Adriano's father," I said, taking the glass she offered and swallowing a long, burning sip. "I know who he is, Bree. The whole city knows who he is. I just don't know why he's looking at you like that." "It wasn't like that." Darcy gave me a look that suggested she was genuinely impressed by my ability to deny the obvious. She glanced back toward the elevated section of the room where Vittore had moved, watching the floor from a vantage point that was far too strategic to be accidental. "If he kills me tonight," she muttered through her teeth, "tell my mother I died dancing." I nearly choked on my drink. The music shifted into something slower and heavier, a visceral beat that seemed to vibrate through the soles of my feet and climb up my spine. Darcy pulled me toward the dance floor before I could object, and the moment I found the rhythm, something inside me finally snapped. I danced. Not to provoke him, not for revenge, not even because I knew he was watching. I danced for the sheer right to feel something other than the cold, hollow emptiness that had lived in my chest since Saturday. But he was watching. I could feel his attention on my skin like a change in the weather, a localized heat that tracked my every movement. It intensified whenever anyone drifted too close to me, a silent pressure that found me even when I turned my head and tried to pretend he wasn't there. Every smile I gave Darcy, every laugh lost in the bass, every man who tried to dance with me, Vittore catalogued it all with the surgical precision of a man preparing to collect on a debt. I lost track of time. The night became a blur of amber lights, rising heat, and the rhythm of my own pulse. But eventually, between songs, I felt a hand close around my arm. It wasn't forceful, but it was absolute. Large, warm fingers circled my elbow with the confidence of someone who had never been told no. I didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Vittore led me away from the floor without a single word. His hand on my arm wasn't just a guide, it was a declaration, a silent signal to the room that I was officially out of circulation. We bypassed the main bar and climbed 3 steps to a secluded area at the back of the club, hidden behind heavy velvet curtains. 2 men in dark suits stood guard, stepping aside without Vittore even glancing their way. The VIP lounge was smaller, darker, and draped in shadows. The music reached us as a muffled, distant throb, as if we were in another world entirely. He released my arm and turned to face me. The sudden absence of his touch was so jarring I nearly swayed toward him, as if he had been the only thing keeping me upright. "You shouldn't be here," he said. His voice was so low I had to lean in to catch the words. Or perhaps I leaned in because I wanted to be closer. "Then why didn't you have me thrown out?" I challenged, lifting my chin to meet his eyes at a distance that had long since stopped being safe. Vittore didn't use words to answer. He raised his hand slowly, his fingers coming to rest just a hair's breadth from my jaw. I could feel the radiant heat of his skin against mine. His dark eyes dropped to my mouth and stayed there, reflecting an internal battle he was clearly losing. "Because I should have," he murmured, the words sounding like a confession forced out of him against his will. I closed the distance. The kiss didn't feel like a choice. It felt like an inevitability. His mouth found mine with a familiarity that suggested he had already memorized the path. It began slow, almost cautious, as if he were giving himself one final heartbeat to turn back. But that restraint lasted only a second. When I gripped the front of his shirt, feeling the tensed muscle and the furnace of his body heat through the fabric, his control shattered. The kiss transformed into something deeper, more desperate. His hand moved to my face, pulling me against him with a hunger that was far from gentle, and I didn't want it to be. The air in the room vanished. The world outside ceased to exist. Everything was reduced to the heat of his mouth and the frantic sound of our breathing. The car ride followed like a fever dream. The side exit of the club, the biting chill of the Chicago air hitting my flushed skin, and the shadowed interior of an armored SUV that was already waiting at the curb. The driver was a ghost, never looking back. Vittore said nothing. His hand rested on my thigh, a heavy, constant presence. His thumb traced slow, mesmerizing circles against the fabric of my dress, each movement stripping away another layer of my resolve, until I didn't want the car to ever stop. The private elevator at the penthouse rose in total silence. The city lights fell away, floor by floor, until we were high above the world. The doors opened directly into his living room, a vast, dark space with floor-to-ceiling windows that turned the skyline into a sprawling masterpiece. I barely took 2 steps inside before his hands were on my waist, turning me, pinning me against the wall. His body was a wall of heat, pressing into mine with a firm, controlled strength. His eyes searched mine, silent and intense, asking if I was sure. I answered by pulling at his shirt. The buttons gave way under my fingers, revealing exactly what the fabric had promised: warm, rigid muscle, and the tension of a body built for power and control. His hands slid down the open back of my dress, and the feel of his skin against my spine pulled a sound from my throat I hadn't planned on making. Clothes became obstacles that were removed with a slow, agonizing precision. He seemed to be memorizing every inch of me, his mouth finding my neck, my collarbone, and the frantic pulse at the base of my throat. Every touch was a claim, a slow-burning fire that made the rest of the world irrelevant. When he finally carried me to the bed, all thought of the past or the future vanished. There was only the wet, heavy heat of his mouth, and the way his hands held my hips, with a grip that I knew would leave marks. I wanted those marks. I wanted the physical evidence that this was real, that I was here by my own volition. The rhythm he established was deep and deliberate. He handled me the way he handled everything else in his life, with absolute authority until the moment he chose to let go. I felt every motion like a wave building in my gut and crashing through my chest, leaving me breathless and reaching for him. His voice whispered things against my skin that I couldn't repeat, words meant only for that moment, spoken to be felt rather than remembered. His composure broke first, a low, guttural sound against my neck as the rhythm shifted, becoming faster and more urgent. I came undone with a tremor that surged through my entire body, a total surrender of my senses. He followed a moment later with one final, deep thrust, a contained groan escaping him as he finally lost the control he guarded so fiercely. Silence returned slowly, marked only by the sound of our breathing syncing up. He didn't pull away. He stayed there, his weight braced on his forearms, his face buried in the curve of my neck. I could feel his warm breath against my skin as his pulse gradually slowed. When he finally looked up, his thumb traced my jaw with a lightness that felt foreign compared to the intensity of the night. His eyes met mine in the darkness, and I searched for the cold, calculating man the world knew as Vittore Montreale. I couldn't find him. What I found instead was something vulnerable and exposed, a version of him that I was certain he showed to no one else. Neither of us spoke, because in that moment, lying in the quiet with the city flickering through the glass and the heat of his body still pressed to mine, a terrifying clarity hit me. This wasn't about revenge. It never had been. And that was the most dangerous realization of all. Chapter 4. What it wasn't was revenge. The first thing that hit me wasn't the light, but the scent. It wasn't the familiar aroma of my own pillows, nor the floral notes of the softener I'd used for years. It certainly wasn't the smell of the neighbor's morning brew that usually seeped through the vents at 7 a.m. like a relentless olfactory alarm clock. This was something different. Cedar, clean linen, and a deep note of sandalwood that anchored itself in my subconscious before my brain had even fully surrendered to the waking world. His scent. It was on the sheets, in the air, and lingering on my own skin like a silent confession. I opened my eyes slowly. The ceiling above was high, smooth, and bathed in the pale, clinical light of a Chicago Saturday morning. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the skyline looked back at me, gray, immense, and entirely indifferent. It felt as though the whole city was holding its breath, waiting to see what I would do next. As I rolled onto my side, the dark silk of the sheets felt cool against my bare skin, a sensation that immediately triggered a landslide of memories from the night before. I felt the phantom weight of his hands, the heat of his mouth, and the ragged sound of his breathing against my neck. I remembered the exact moment his legendary control had shattered, a sound I had locked away in a part of my mind where fascination and fear shared the same space. I slept with my ex-fiancé's father. The sentence formed with the cold, clinical detachment of a medical diagnosis. I repeated it mentally 3 times, as if the repetition could make it feel like something other than a total departure from reality. I, Brielle, 24 years old, who only a week ago had a fiancé, a ring, and a future that fit neatly inside a silver picture frame, was lying in Vittore Montreal's bed. He was the patriarch, the man who silenced rooms just by entering them, and the night before, he had looked at me as if I were the most dangerous thing he had ever encountered. The left side of the bed was empty. The pillow still held the impression of his head, and when I reached out to touch the fabric, it was still faintly warm. He hadn't been gone long. I realized I had a narrow window to do the only reasonable thing left: get out before reality caught up with me in the form of a conversation. I climbed out of bed, locating my scattered clothes with an urgency that made my face flush in the morning light. My black dress wasn't on the floor. It was folded neatly on the armchair beside the bed. It hadn't been tossed. It had been handled with care. The thought that Vittore, the cold, calculating Don, had stood over me in the dead of night to fold my dress with that trademark precision made me freeze. I couldn't decide if I felt a flicker of tenderness or a surge of pure panic. I dressed quickly, attempting to tame my hair into some semblance of order, and stepped out into the hallway barefoot. I held my heels in my hand like a pair of weapons I intended to use in my escape. The penthouse was silent, its dark gray walls and hardwood floors designed for quiet movement, as if even the architecture had been taught to obey the master of the house. The smell of coffee stopped me before I reached the exit. The kitchen was to the right, separated from the living area by a gleaming slab of dark marble, and there he was, Vittore Montreal, seated on a tall stool, a cup in one hand and the morning paper in the other, as if this Saturday were no different than any other, as if he hadn't turned my world inside out just hours ago. He wore a fresh white shirt, sleeves already rolled back to his forearms with that irritating, sharp precision. He looked rested, controlled, and perfectly in place. I, on the other hand, was the definition of a disaster. His eyes found me before I could decide whether to retreat or press forward. He scanned me from head to toe, not with the heat of the night before, but with a look of contained amusement that he hid behind the rim of his cup as he took a sip. "Coffee?" he offered. His tone was casual, as if he were receiving a guest for a scheduled board meeting. I stood in the middle of the hall, barefoot, clutching my shoes and the tattered remnants of my dignity. I looked at him, at the coffee, at the city shimmering behind him, and the question escaped before I could filter it. "Do you ever actually sleep?" Vittore took another sip, his dark eyes never leaving mine. He had the patience of a man who knew that time, like everything else, belonged to him. "I did," he said softly. "You were there." The air in the room suddenly felt heavy. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks at the bluntness of his words. Clutching my heels as a sort of emotional scaffolding, I did the only thing I could. I walked to the counter and sat on the stool beside him. He poured the coffee without asking for my preferences. It was black and bitter, exactly how I didn't take it, but I didn't correct him. Arguing over sugar with Vittore Montreal after sharing his bed felt like a level of domestic intimacy I wasn't remotely prepared for. The coffee was strong enough to wake my pulse. We sat in a silence that was full of the things neither of us was ready to say out loud. Every time I glanced at him, I found him studying me with an expression I couldn't decipher, something between vigilance and genuine fascination, as if I were a variable that refused to fit his equations. "I need to go," I finally said, though the words lacked the conviction I'd intended. Vittore set his cup down with a slow, deliberate movement. The room seemed to shrink as he turned his full attention to me. "You do," he agreed. It wasn't a challenge. It was an acknowledgement that I was making a choice, and that he, for reasons I could tell cost him physically, was not going to interfere. "I'm not running," I added, needing him to understand. "I just need to think." A flash of something, recognition perhaps, crossed his eyes. He gave a minimal nod, standing with a fluid grace that made even the simplest gesture look like a calculated move. "The driver will take you," he stated. It wasn't an offer. It was an instruction. I could have fought him on it. I could have insisted on calling my own cab to prove I didn't need the Montreal name protecting me. But the part of me that wanted to prove my independence was exhausted, and the part that wanted to feel the weight of his attention for a few more minutes was stronger than my pride. "Thank you," I said. Vittore walked me to the private elevator, standing like a silent guardian as the doors prepared to close. He didn't speak, but his eyes were locked on mine with an intensity that seemed to say everything he refused to put into a sentence. When the doors finally shut, I leaned my head against the steel wall and closed my eyes. The ride home was a blur of tinted glass. The driver was a ghost, trained not to acknowledge my existence. As I watched Chicago roll by, the physical memory of the night before wouldn't leave me. But it wasn't just the touch. It was the way he'd looked at me afterward, when the urgency had given way to something slower and more dangerous. This wasn't revenge. I'd known it the second he touched me. It wasn't about hurting Adriano or getting even. It was a raw, terrifying, and genuine desire for the man himself. When I stepped into my apartment in Wicker Park, the familiar sights greeted me: the unfolded blanket on the couch, the color-coded books, the cold cup of tea from Friday night. I felt like a stranger in my own life. I showered, dressed, and sat in the silence, trying to understand how a single week could hold an engagement, a betrayal, a revenge that turned into desire, and a man who looked at me like I was both the answer and the problem. At 9 o'clock that night, the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. I looked through the peephole and my stomach dropped. Adriano. He was standing in the hall, wearing a dark coat and that mixture of charm and urgency he used when he believed persistence was a universal key. His jaw was tight, his blue eyes hard, and his hands were shoved into his pockets with the stiffness of someone holding back a punch. I could have ignored it. It would have been smarter. But I wasn't afraid of Adriano Montreali anymore. I was disgusted. I was furious, and I had a visceral need to look him in the eye so he would know, beyond a doubt, that he could no longer hurt me. I opened the door. He shoved his way inside, his arrogance filling my living room like a physical presence. He turned to me, his face twisted with rage. "I know what you did," he spat, his voice trembling. "You slept with my father, Brielle." With my father. I closed the door and leaned against it, crossing my arms. I wasn't going to let him see me falter. "And how did you find out?" I asked calmly. "Does it matter?" he snapped, taking a step toward me. "You did it to destroy me, to humiliate me, to twist the knife." "I did it," I said, looking him straight in the eye, because I wanted to. The simplicity of the truth stopped him mid-step. He'd come expecting tears, guilt, or excuses. He wasn't prepared for the fact that I owed him nothing. "You're a traitor," he snarled. "You were in bed with my cousin," I countered, my voice like ice. "Less than 24 hours after you proposed. You lost the right to call me anything." He shifted gears instantly, trying to put on his mask of regret. His shoulders dropped, and his voice softened. "I messed up, Brie. Allegra meant nothing. It was a mistake, a moment of weakness. But we can fix this. We had something real." I looked at his outstretched hand and felt nothing but pity. He actually thought a few chosen words could erase the image of my cousin on his pillow. "No," I said firmly. "We didn't have anything real, Adriano. Because if we had, you wouldn't have done what you did." The mask shattered for good. A cold, ugly smile spread across his face, a look I'd never seen on him before. It made me realize how much of this man I had never truly known. "My father will get bored of you," he whispered, his voice sharp as a razor. "He gets bored of everyone. You're just the novelty right now. And when he loses interest, because he will, you'll be alone with no one." The door slammed with a force that shook the walls. I stood in the silence, my mind racing. The question wasn't just how he knew, but why he knew so fast. I had left the penthouse that morning, and hours later, Adriano was at my door. Someone in Vittore's orbit was feeding him information. Someone was loyal to the son over the father, but it was his parting words that lingered, burrowing into the softest parts of my heart. "He gets bored of everyone." The fear of being disposable, of being a temporary distraction, was a cold weight in my chest. I took a deep breath and opened my eyes. Adriano wasn't done. The look on his face as he left wasn't the look of a man who had accepted defeat. It was the look of someone redirecting his anger. I was no longer the target. He was going after his father. Chapter 5. His. By choice. I woke up Sunday morning with Adriano's sentence still taking up space inside my head like a guest who refuses to leave. "He gets tired of everyone." The words had spent the night circling, tangling in the corners of my thoughts, showing up every time I closed my eyes and tried to sleep. And now, under the gray light of another Chicago morning pouring through the bedroom window, they were still there, patient, poisonous, waiting to see if I would let them win. I wouldn't. I showered, put on black pants and a turtleneck sweater, pulled my hair into a bun that was more practicality than style, and brewed coffee in the kitchen of my Wicker Park apartment while staring at the phone on the counter without touching it. I could call Tessa, who would listen to everything with that solid patience of hers, and tell me something both comforting and brutally honest at the same time. I could call Darcy, who would turn the entire drama into an accidental comedy in under 3 sentences, but the truth was that the conversation I needed to have wasn't with either of them. It was with Vittore. I wasn't going to sit in my apartment stewing in the poison Adriano left behind. I wasn't going to spend Sunday analyzing every word, every look, every possibility like someone putting together a puzzle without the picture on the box. If there was a truth to find, it was with the man who touched me, as if he were making a promise, and looked at me afterward, as if he were afraid of breaking it, and I was going to get it, head on my feet, without asking permission. I hailed a cab on the sidewalk, gave the penthouse address, and spent the entire ride staring out the window without seeing the city passing outside, because all I could see was the image of Vittore that Saturday morning in the kitchen, the black coffee, the eyes that wouldn't let me go, the sentence that had dropped into the air between us with the simplicity of a confession he didn't even realize he was making. I did. You were there. The penthouse building was a monolith of glass and steel in the heart of Chicago, the kind of structure that doesn't need a sign at the entrance because anyone who needs to know already does. The doorman recognized me, or was instructed to recognize me, and waved toward the private elevator without asking questions. The doors opened, I stepped in, and the silent ascent to the top floor gave me time to mentally rehearse what I was going to say, and to discard every version for being inadequate, cowardly, or too rehearsed. The doors opened directly into the penthouse living room, and I found an apartment different from the one I had left the morning before. The terrace curtains were open, the Chicago skyline glittered beneath the cold midday sun, and the entire space had the tense air of a place where something had just happened, like a stage where the main scene is already over, but the emotional temperature hasn't come down yet. Vittore was on the terrace. He had his back to me, his forearms resting on the glass railing, his body leaning forward as if the weight of something were pushing him down. The posture was different from anything I had seen from him up to that point. Vittore Montreali didn't bend, he made the world bend around him. But there, alone, with the Chicago wind tousling his dark hair and the entire city stretched out below as if awaiting orders, he looked like a man carrying something that didn't fit inside the armor he wore for the rest of the world. He turned when he heard my footsteps on the marble floor of the living room. His eyes found me, and what I saw there made me stop in the middle of the room. It wasn't the heat from the night at the club. It wasn't the restrained glow from the morning over coffee. It wasn't the silent intensity of someone studying every detail of my face, as if it were a map to a place he needed to reach. It was something else, colder, more closed off, with sharp edges that kept me at a distance before I could get close enough to touch him. He looked at me the way he would look at someone in an interrogation, and I understood, before he opened his mouth, that something had changed between Saturday morning and this Sunday at noon. Adriano was here, I said, because the conclusion formed on its own from everything I could see. The posture, the look, the heavy air of the apartment, the stiffness of his shoulders that seemed less like control and more like containment. It wasn't a question. Vittore released the railing and turned his entire body in my direction, his hands sliding into his pockets with that gesture I was already learning to read, his gesture when he's preparing for something that requires precision. "This morning," he confirmed, and his voice came out lower than usual, with a note of gravity that hadn't been there the morning before. "At the mansion." He came to my office. The Montreal mansion was in Lake Forest, 40 minutes from downtown, the family's official residence, where Vittore received guests, negotiated, and maintained the kind of life the downtown penthouse couldn't accommodate. The penthouse was something else, the space that belonged only to him, without the weight of the family name on the walls. I walked to the terrace and stopped just inside the door, one step of distance between us that felt larger than the physical space suggested. The wind came in cold through the opening and hit my face, but I didn't move to close it, because the chill kept me sharp in a way I had a feeling I was going to need in the next few minutes. What did he say? Vittore studied me for a second, long, heavy, calculating something I couldn't access. Then he spoke, without preamble, without softening, the way a man speaks who doesn't know how to cushion truths, and who, even if he did, wouldn't waste the time. "Adriano said you used me." The sentence came out like a blade laid on the table, precise, cold, unadorned. That the night at the club was revenge, that you wanted to return the humiliation he caused you, and that I was the instrument you chose. The air on the terrace went still. The wind kept blowing. The city kept moving down below. But between the two of us, the entire world seemed to hold its breath. "He said," Vittore continued, and I noticed that every word cost him more than the last, not out of weakness, but because he was giving me the chance to hear everything before responding. That I wasn't desire. I was strategy. The sentence hit a place inside me I didn't expect. Not because it was a lie, but because there was a piece of truth inside it, and that piece hurt more than the entire accusation. I looked at Vittore and saw, behind the coldness in his eyes, something that made my stomach sink. Fear. Not the fear of someone facing an external threat. The fear of someone discovering that the only person who managed to get beneath the armor may have done so with a purpose that wasn't love. I could lie. It would be easy, clean, and painless, at least in the short term. I could say there had never been any plan, that every second between us had been spontaneous and pure, and Vittore might believe it because he wanted to believe it, the same way I had wanted to believe Adriano's smile right up until the moment I opened his bedroom door. But I wasn't Adriano, and if there was one thing I had learned that week, it was that comfortable lies are the beginning of everything that falls apart. Yes, I said. The word fell between us like a stone into water, and I saw the impact cross his face in a fraction of a second before he recovered control. A minimal tremor in his jaw, a shadow in his eyes, the hand in his pocket closing into a fist. He relaxed before I could be sure I'd seen it. Yes, I wanted revenge, I continued, holding his gaze with everything I had, because if I was going to tell the truth, I was going to tell it standing up, looking him in the eye, without flinching. Yes, the plan was to get close to someone in Adriano's circle and return the humiliation. Yes, when I went to that club, I knew it was Montreal territory. And yes, when I saw you there, part of me thought it was the perfect opportunity. Vittore didn't move. He didn't blink, didn't take a deep breath, didn't make any of the gestures people make when they hear something that hurts. He stood there, motionless, like the marble statue the entire city believed him to be. But I saw the crack. I saw the instant the last sentence landed on him, and something behind his eyes closed, like a door someone locks from the inside because what's on the other side is unbearable. But, I said, and the word came out with a force I hadn't planned, torn from a place inside me that refused to let the truth remain incomplete. But what happened between us was not part of the plan. Not a single thing I felt when you touched me, when you looked at me, when I woke up in your bed, and the first thing I thought of wasn't Adriano but you. None of that was strategy. I didn't choose to feel what I felt. I didn't imagine I was going to fall for you. And if you want me to leave because of how it started, I will. With my head held high, like always. But I'm not going to lie to stay. That's not how I work. The Chicago wind blew between us, cold and cutting, and I felt my eyes burn, not from tears, but from something deeper, the kind of emotion that scorches when you hold it in too long, and it decides to come out on its own. I had just handed him everything I had, the whole truth, unfiltered, unprotected, without the safety net of a lie that would have made things easier. And now I was standing there, on his terrace, with the wind in my hair and my heart exposed, waiting to find out if honesty was enough, or if I had just destroyed the only good thing that disastrous week had given me. Vittore looked at me. His eyes traveled over my face with the attention of someone searching for something specific. The lie, the calculation, the hidden motive he'd been trained his entire life to find in every person who came close to him. I felt the weight of that examination like something almost physical, a pressure pushing me backward. At the same time, I planted my feet on the ground and refused to retreat. He didn't find what he was looking for, and I saw the exact moment he realized he wasn't going to find it. A minimal shift in his expression, like a piece clicking into place and changing the entire picture. The stiffness in his shoulders gave an inch. The fist inside his pocket opened. His eyes lost their sharp edge and gained something I had only seen once before, on the second to last night, in the dark of the bedroom, after the world had already shrunk to fit the space between our bodies. "Since the night of the engagement," he said, and his voice carried the weight of something that had been held in silence for too long. "Since the first time I saw you up close, I noticed the beauty, any fool would, but that's not what undid me." He pulled his hands from his pockets and turned toward the skyline, as if looking at me while saying this was more than he could bear. "It was the way you looked at me when I shook your hand," he continued, "without fear, without the flinch everyone else gives, without the deference, without the calculation of someone weighing what they can get from me. You looked at me like I was a man, not a title, not a threat, not the power I carry on my back. And I didn't know what to do with that, because no one has looked at me that way in longer than I can remember." He went quiet for a moment, his jaw working as if the next words needed to be ripped out by force. "I buried all of it," he said, Because you were his. Because he's my son. And I've already failed him in ways I'll never be able to fix. His betrayal didn't create what I feel for you, Brielle. His betrayal set free what was already there. And I need you to know that before you decide anything. I processed every word, let each one settle inside me, and take up the space it deserved, without rush, without the urgency to respond, before I understood. Vittore Montreal, the man who controlled an entire city with a look, had just told me I disarmed him, that I was the crack in the control he had spent decades building. And the way he said it, with his back to me, looking at the city as if it were easier to confess to the horizon than to my eyes, showed me more than any words could, that it cost him, that vulnerability, for a man who had turned invulnerability into an identity, was the greatest risk he had ever taken. Is this about me? I asked, and I felt the question cost me as much as his words had cost him. Or is it about winning? Vittore turned. His eyes met mine, and what I saw there was so bare, so stripped of calculation and armor, that I had to fight the impulse to step back, not out of fear, but from the intensity of receiving head-on the honesty of someone who doesn't know how to be honest without it hurting. If it were about winning, he said, his voice rough and low, every syllable carrying the weight of a truth he wasn't accustomed to offering, I would have done this differently. You're the first thing I've wanted, and didn't know how to take. I crossed the distance between us. 2 steps. That was all that separated us, and when I took them, it felt like crossing a line that had existed since the night of the engagement, since the handshake that lasted too long, since the look I pushed to the back of my mind and that refused to disappear. I stopped in front of him, lifted my face, and placed my hand on his chest, over his heart, over the warmth, over the place where a lifetime of control was breaking beneath my fingers. I choose to stay, I said, not for revenge, not on impulse, because what I feel is real, and I refuse to be afraid of it. His hand rose and covered mine, pressing my fingers against his chest with a pressure that said everything he wasn't going to be able to say with words, at least not yet. At least not on that winter Sunday with the Chicago wind whistling around us like the only sound left in the world. Sunday night. Chicago's lights pulsed through the living room window like an earthbound constellation, and I was leaning against Vittore's shoulder on the penthouse couch, my legs tucked beneath a blanket, and his hand in my hair, his fingers tracing slow lines that made me close my eyes and forget the world existed beyond those glass walls. Peace. That was what I felt, and the strangeness of feeling peace in a place that, a week ago, I didn't know existed, made me smile in the dark without him seeing. Or maybe he did see, because the fingers in my hair paused for an instant, and then resumed with something that felt like tenderness, that felt like care, that felt like all the things the world believed Vittore Montreal was incapable of offering. But as the silence settled and his breathing became slow and steady beside me, an image floated into my mind uninvited. Adriano's face, not the face from the night before, when he left my apartment with the poisoned sentence on his lips. A different face, the one Vittore had described without realizing it when he told me about the morning at the office. The face of a man who had been silenced by his father, and who left the room not with anger, not with defeat, but with something else. Patience, perhaps. Calculation. The expression of someone who lost a round, and is already rearranging the pieces on the board before the next move. I pushed the thought away, squeezed my eyes shut, and nestled closer against Vittore's shoulder, feeling his warmth cross through the fabric of the sweater and reach my skin like a promise I wanted to believe in with everything I had. The thought pulled back. Almost. Not entirely. Lena here. That wraps up book 1, and I've already finished book 2. You can get access to it for a really small fee. He said he chose me, said I was the first thing he ever wanted and didn't know how to take. I believed him. I dropped my weapons, lowered my walls, slept in his bed as if the world didn't exist, and for 2 weeks it didn't, until I found the photograph. Viviana, a woman from Vittore's past. Beautiful, elegant, and far too close to him to be a coincidence. Someone he was never able to have. And now, this woman is back. At the same restaurants, on the same streets, far too close to the man who swore he was mine. The question destroying me isn't whether he's cheating on me. It's whether he ever stopped wanting her, and the answer might destroy me. Like I said, that was just a taste of book 2. To watch it uncensored, just click on the first link here in the pinned comment. I'll see you on the other side in a few seconds. Remember, just click on the first link down here in the comments, and book 2 complete. No ads, no interruptions, will already be available for you. It's very simple. Book 2 is something I'm loving making. You're loving it too, so I promise there will be more. It's where you find increasingly spicy stories, a true dark romance. And precisely because this version is getting more and more heated, the video isn't well accepted publicly on YouTube. This closed environment is where I can actually share my essence and where I feel free to do my best work for you. More news coming soon. I'll be waiting for you on the other side.